On December 18, 1962, NBC aired the first animated Christmas special made for TV, Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol. The special is about Mr. Magoo, starring in a Broadway musical version of A Christmas Carol. It starts off with Mr. Magoo singing "It's Good to Be Back on Broadway" and doing his usual antics because he's too cheap to buy glasses. This and the ending are the only times we, if you pardon the pun, see Magoo do his crazy antics. While characters like the Ghost of Christmas Present would make reference to his poor eyesight, they actually take the story seriously. Although Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol follows the Dickens story closely, they do make some changes. One of them is the omission of two characters, Scrooge's sister Fan, though she is referenced on the chalkboard, and his nephew Fred. I find it strange they omitted Fred, since Magoo does have a nephew named Waldo. No, not that Waldo. That Waldo. Why couldn't they get him to play the part? The second change is in the order the ghost visits Scrooge. Every adaptation I've ever seen of A Christmas Carol placed the order as past, present, and future. Here, the present visits before the past. It's kind of jarring, but it's a minor complaint. Aside from Magoo, the only well-known character in the play is Gerald McBoing-Boing. I guess he must have taken speech therapy, since he talks normal instead of going boing boing. Plus, he has a craving for raspberry dressing. Is there such a thing? I have to say, whoever they got to play Bob Cratchit looks exactly like George Jetson. He could be an ancestor. That would explain why George would, well, that's another video entirely. The songs are very catchy, my favorites being Ringle Ringle and The Lord's Bright Blessing. Although all the actors have a great singing voice, I think Jack Cassidy, who does the voice of Cratchit, has the best one. Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol would later lead to the short-lived series called The Famous Adventures of Mr. Magoo. Like the special, the series showed Magoo acting out classic stories. Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol is a special far more glorious than grand. The book A Christmas Carol begins with the words "Marley is dead." While this animated version from 1969 doesn't include narration, it does show Scrooge walking by the cemetery where his partner is buried, and he's remembering the funeral from 7 years before. Scrooge has spent as little money as possible on Jacob Marley's funeral, because finery would be wasted on him. The gravedigger points out that Marley had been his friend and partner, but this doesn't move Scrooge. If you think Scrooge is cheap with Marley's funeral here, you should see Mickey's Christmas Carol, but that's another video. Speaking of Marley, my God, is he freaky! Normally, Marley would still look human, but this one, he looks like a skeleton with a skull on fire. Who needs the other three ghosts? Seeing Marley would scare anybody straight. Though maybe not this version of Scrooge. Typically, when the Ghost of Christmas Past, who for some reason looks like Father Time, shows Scrooge the past, he normally acts nostalgic when he sees the party at Fezziwig's, and heartbroken when he sees Belle break off their engagement. This Scrooge, however, said after Fezziwig's party that he had grown older and wiser since. He doesn't feel the need to bring happiness the way his former employer did. As for the breakup of Belle, he states that if she had any sense, she would have remained with him because she would have been better off. I guess you could say that this is a more realistic reaction from somebody who is as cold-hearted as Scrooge. We don't see him soften up until he witnesses the party at Bob Cratchit's house, and he starts to take an interest in Tiny Tim. The Ghost of Christmas Present later makes the observation that Scrooge doesn't respond to kindness. It is true that we really don't start to see Scrooge reform until he meets the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. Up until I started working on this series, I was unaware that this version existed. So what do I think of it? It's good, but it has its flaws. One of them is that when Fred visited Scrooge, they sing a song. It comes out of nowhere, and there isn't another musical number throughout the special. Not to mention that we don't get to see Scrooge go to Fred's party, or give money to the charity collectors. At least Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol was established as a musical, and there was no Fred. Also, he gave money to the charity collectors. Another thing that bothered me about this special is that there was this run-on gag where Scrooge would sniff some snuff and try to sneeze, but he can't. The reason why he can't is because he's too mean to give a good sneeze, according to the Ghost of Christmas Present. Too mean to give a good sneeze? How does being mean affect your ability to sneeze? The special ends where Scrooge finally sneezes. Call me old-fashioned, but I prefer the traditional ending where Tiny Tim says God bless us everyone. Still, the voice acting is good, and I do enjoy some of the character designs, especially the one they gave Marley. Scrooge slowly starting to soften his attitude is an interesting interpretation of the character. Ordinarily, I am not a fan of this approach, but this version does a good job with it. A Christmas Carol from 1969 is not the best version of the story, but it's nothing to sneeze at either. My favorite version of A Christmas Carol has always been the 1951 movie starring Alistair Sim as Scrooge and Michael Hordern as Marley. It expanded on many details of the story that Dickens never covered, like how Scrooge and Marley met. What I didn't know until recently was that 20 years later, Sim and Hordern reprised their roles in an animated version from 1971. Produced by Chuck Jones and directed by Richard Williams, the 1971 A Christmas Carol is perhaps the most beautifully animated version of the story. It's amazing how much effort Williams put into the animation, considering that it was meant for TV. The art style, which is based off the illustrations by John Leech, is not only fun to look at, it gives the special a disturbing feel. Just look at Wanton Ignorance. They don't even look human. Or the scene with the fence. Wouldn't he give you a nightmare? Then there's Jacob Marley, who manages to be scarier than he was in the 1969 version. The special includes details from the book that are left out in most adaptations, like the Phantom Hearse, the Ghost of Christmas Present taking Scrooge to visit poor miners, and they even made the Ghost of Christmas Past look exactly as Dickens described her. If I have any complaint against Richard Williams' A Christmas Carol, It's that at times it feels like it's rushing the story. The best example of this is the scene where Scrooge is talking to the charity collectors. He doesn't even take a breath when he's talking to them. The problem is that the special is only a half hour long. It should have been at least an hour to allow the story to go at a slower pace. Still, Richard Williams' A Christmas Carol is a great adaptation for fans who want something closer to the book. It's also great that Alistair Sim and Michael Hordern came back to reprise their roles. Even though I prefer them in the 1951 movie, they're still great here. One interesting bit of trivia about this special is that it was shown in theaters after it aired on TV. It went on to win an Oscar for Best Animated Short. There was such an outrage over the fact that an animated short that first appeared on TV won the Oscar that the board banned all future shorts that first appeared on TV from even being considered to win the Oscar. It was such a silly protest because Richard Williams' A Christmas Carol deserved to win. In 1956, the Alco Hour aired an adaptation of A Christmas Carol called The Stingiest Man in Town, starring Basil Rathbone in the role of Scrooge. In 1978, Rankin Bass, the studio that brought us many Christmas classics, did their own version of the special. It seemed like a match made in heaven, a beloved Christmas story being adapted by the best studio for making Christmas specials. Yet, for most people, The Stingiest Man in Town tends to be among their least favorite versions of the story. Even the most hardcore Rankin Bass fan tend to dismiss The Stingiest Man in Town. The problem most people have with this special is the inclusion of a Jiminy Cricket-like narrator named Bah Humbug. Get it? Because Scrooge's catchphrase is Bah Humbug? It's a bad pun that would cause many adults and some kids to do a facepalm. A lot of folks view Bah Humbug's inclusion as a way to appeal to kids, which I tend to agree. Honestly, I never found him annoying. Part of that has to do with his voice actor, Tom Bosley, who played Howard Cunningham on Happy Days and also was the voice of David the Gnome. I don't think The Stingiest Man in Town is that bad. It may be aimed at younger kids, but it never tries to dumb down the story. It manages to capture the creepy atmosphere of the story without being too scary for kids. I also give this special points for showing Marley while he was alive. Most specials don't do that. The songs aren't bad, but they're not as memorable as ones in other Rankin Bass specials. The one song that bothered me was the one where Mrs. Cratchit sings a song about Santa Claus to Tiny Tim. The song wouldn't be bad if it was in a different special, but this is A Christmas Carol, a story about a heartless old miser finding redemption after being shown the error of his ways. That's deeper than whether or not Santa is real. Lord's Bright Lesson from Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol is a much better song because it deals with the Cratchit children longing for a Christmas dinner that's better than the one they have, and Bob Cratchit promising that someday they will, but they should be grateful for what they have. That fits with the story way better than a song about Santa being real. The Stingiest Man in Town is a decent adaptation of A Christmas Carol, but it's one I tend to skip over. In 1953, Disney released the Mickey Mouse short The Simple Things. This short is significant in that it was the last Mickey Mouse cartoon made in Walt Disney's lifetime. Although Mickey would continue to be a pop culture icon, his film career sadly remained in limbo for 30 years. Then on December 16, 1983, he made his big comeback playing Bob Cratchit in Mickey's Christmas Carol. Although Mickey's name is in the title, the real star is Scrooge McDuck, who plays, well, Scrooge. He is just as nasty as his namesake, if not worse. For starters, he states that Marley left him enough money for his tombstone, but he had him buried at sea. Wow! The 1951 version showed Scrooge apathetic about Marley dying, but at least he gave him a burial. Same with the 1969 version. Scrooge may have spent as little money as possible, but he still spent something for a burial. This Scrooge just took the money and had Marley buried at sea. It's also interesting that he X'd out Marley's name instead of buying a new sign, or just leaving it alone, like he does in most adaptions. In most adaptions, as well as the original book, Scrooge gave Cratchit the whole day off with pay. This version of Scrooge gave Cratchit half a day off without pay. If there was a prize for the cheapest Scrooge, this one would win it. He also had the most creative way of saying no to the charity collectors, played by Rat and Mole, I've ever heard. Scrooge basically told them that they'd be out of a job if they gave money to the poor because they wouldn't be poor anymore, ignoring the fact that the poor will always exist. The big turning point for Scrooge in the Christmas Carol is when Belle, or Isabel as she's called here, breaks off their engagement. Here, it is Scrooge who breaks off their engagement. Why? Because she was late on her last payment of the honeymoon college, so he foreclosed. In some ways, making Scrooge the one who breaks off the engagement is a little more powerful. It shows us what a jerk he's become, since he is willing to foreclose on the woman he was going to marry. That doesn't mean that this Scrooge doesn't have heart. He shows remorse over the way he treated Isabel. He felt the Cratchits should have more food than they got. And he felt bad when Tiny Tim died. Also, he was extremely generous with his donation to the charity collectors. He even put some money down Molly's pants. I love that part. I always thought it was funny how after Scrooge's redemption, he just puts on his coat, hat, and scarf over his PJs. Once you think he's actually going to get dressed, he just grabs his cane and considers himself fully dressed. Mr. Magoo did something similar to this, but eventually he got dressed. Scrooge McDuck never did. What most people don't know about Mickey's Christmas Carol was that originally it was a record from 1974. The record is mostly what you see in the cartoon, only some of the cast is different. For instance, Merlin was the ghost of Christmas Past instead of Jiminy Cricket. The ghost of Christmas Future was the queen from Snow White instead of Pete. And Honest John and Gideon from Pinocchio were the charity collectors instead of Rat and Mole. I say that last change was for the best, because who would actually believe that Honest John and Gideon would give the money to charity? As I've mentioned in other videos, Mickey's Christmas Carol marks the debut of Alan Young as Scrooge, who also served as a co-writer of the story. It also was sadly the last time Clarence Nash provided the voice of Donald. Mickey's Christmas Carol was my first introduction of A Christmas Carol, and it has remained one of my favorites. The animation is amazing. The voice acting wonderful. It's fun to try to catch each character's cameo. And then there's the opening song, Oh What a Merry Christmas Day. How come they never play that on the radio? Richard Williams' A Christmas Carol may have been a more faithful adaptation of the book, but its half-hour format caused the story to feel rushed at times. Mickey's Christmas Carol doesn't try to remain faithful to the book. It covers the basic elements of the book, then allows the Disney characters to tell the story in their own way, thus giving us a half-hour cartoon that effectively tells the story of A Christmas Carol without feeling rushed. Famed critics Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert weren't too pleased with Mickey's Christmas Carol. Their complaints were that it didn't emphasize Mickey's character and that it failed to live up to the classic cartoons. Were they expecting Mickey to be cast as Scrooge? Bob Cratchit was the perfect role for him because Mickey is an all-round good guy. Scrooge McDuck, on the other hand, has the name Scrooge. It's a no-brainer on who should be in that role. As for not being able to live up to the classic cartoons, I say it's become a classic in its own right, thus proving that critics are not always right. Unlike Mr. Magoo or Mickey, the Jetsons aren't acting out the story of A Christmas Carol. They play it like a typical episode from the show, and use elements from the book that suits them. Jane, Judy, and Elroy go out on Christmas Eve to do some last-minute Christmas shopping, while George is stuck working overtime for Mr. Spacely. Astro opens up his present early to find that he got a robot cat to chase. After a mishap with his gift, Astro ends up swallowing a sprocket, causing him to become sick. What's worse is that all the vets are closed because it's Christmas Eve. Meanwhile, Mr. Spacely stays at his office to guard his money. He is then visited by his old business partner, Marsley, who for some reason is wrapped up like a mummy instead of chains. As you might expect, Marsley warns Spacely about the free Ghost of Christmases. Spacely, however, is unconcerned about them. If you thought Scrooge from the 1969 version was hard-hearted, you haven't seen Mr. Spacely. When the Ghost of Christmas Past, which is an add-in machine, takes Spacely to the past, we see that George had worked for him as a kid. His job was to run Spacely's lemonade stand, which he only got a penny for. You would think by now that George would try to find employment with someone else. Spacely expresses no remorse for his behavior. He even finds it funny. Unlike Scrooge, Spacely got to marry the love of his life. Then there's the Ghost of Christmas Present, who is also a present. Get it? Anyway, he shows Spacely that Astro is near death. Spacely is unmoved by this. What would it take for Spacely to see the error of his ways? Well, technically he never does. But there is something that made him behave better towards the Jetsons. The Ghost of Christmas Future shows him a large mansion he assumes belongs to him. It turns out it belongs to the Jetsons, who are incredibly rich. How did they get so rich? It turns out it was a spacely sprocket that Astro swallowed, causing him to die. So George sued Spacely for everything he's worth. Although we never see future Spacely, George states that he was last seen on Skid Row. Not wanting to get sued, Spacely sends his family vet to treat Astro, and he buys the Jetsons presents. The Jetsons' Christmas Carol is one of the best loose adaptations of the story. The characters all behave exactly as you expect them to, and it's pretty funny that it was a lawsuit that caused Spacely to act nicer towards them. Oh well, some people don't respond to emotion. A Christmas Carol is one of the most well-known Christmas stories. Everyone knows that on Christmas Eve, an old miser named Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by the ghost of his dead partner, Jacob Marley, and the free ghost of Christmas, who shows Scrooge the error of his ways. As a result, Scrooge becomes a better man. Have you ever wondered what would happen if somebody stopped the free ghost of Christmas from changing Scrooge? If you have, the real Ghostbusters provide the answer in their episode XMAS Marks the Spot. The Ghostbusters are driving home from a job in upstate New York. All of them are pretty upset having to work on Christmas Eve, except for Peter. He hates Christmas. The reason is that his dad was always away for Christmas when he was a kid. That always bothered Peter. So he tried to pretend like he didn't care about Christmas. He pretended so long that he started to believe it. Anyway, Ecto-1 stalls near a town that looks like it came from Victorian England. As they are searching for a phone, Egon picks up some PKE readings at the home of Ebenezer Scrooge. Jacob Marley, perhaps sensing the Ghostbusters nearby, leaves the house. The Ghostbusters enter the house and bust the free ghost of Christmas. After getting Ecto-1 running again, they return home. They notice a few changes. First, Janine and Slimer say bah humbug to Christmas. Then, as Peter, Ray, and Winston go out to get a tree, they find that everyone they meet has the same attitude towards Christmas. There wasn't any decorations on Fifth Avenue. They come across a book called A Christmas Humbug by Ebenezer Scrooge. Realizing their mistake, the guys rush back to the firehouse to stop Egon from emptying the ghost trap. They are too late. Egon enters the containment unit to try to get them back. Just in case he fails, Peter, Ray, and Winston go back in time to impersonate the ghost of Christmas. This is the funniest part of the episode. Peter plays the ghost of Christmas past. He has Scrooge wear a viewfinder as he pushes him around the room in a wheelchair. Winston plays the ghost of Christmas present. He swings Scrooge around on a rope to look at the poor people in town. Ray, of course, is the ghost of Christmas future. Since the ghost doesn't talk, Ray plays Rage with Scrooge. Although they are trying their best, Scrooge fails to learn anything from them It's hilarious how mad Peter got when Scrooge didn't get what he was supposed to learn. Peter, however, does learn something. He tells Scrooge that just because he had a rotten past doesn't mean he should blame Christmas. Everyone has Christmases that weren't the best. If you give up, you end up depriving yourself something you're mad about never having. That's a pretty deep message coming from Peter. Xmas Marks the Spot is a great what-if story. It does a great job at showing us what Scrooge would have done if the ghost of Christmas were taken away. I also love how the episode never turns Peter into Scrooge. He still behaved like himself, only he hates Christmas. It fits his character perfectly, considering his relationship with his father. I highly recommend this episode if you're a fan of the Ghostbusters and A Christmas Carol. This episode isn't the only connection Ghostbusters have with the story. Bill Murray, who played Peter in the movies, starred in the movie Scrooged. IDW did a comic where the Ghostbusters encountered the ghost of Christmas. It's best to pretend that comic doesn't exist. Trust me. The Muppet Christmas Carol is a significant movie in the history of the Muppets. It was the first movie they made since the death of their creator, Jim Henson, much like how Mickey's Christmas Carol was the first theatrical Mickey cartoon since the death of Walt Disney. It also marked a different direction for the Muppet movies than what had been done before. It was an adaptation of a popular book. The focus is on a human character rather than a Muppet. And the main Muppets are Gonzo and Rizzo, instead of Kermit. It was also dedicated to Jim Henson and Richard Hunt. Now that the history lesson is out of the way, let's get to the movie. Gonzo plays the part of Charles Dickens, and narrator of the story. He is able to know everything that happens, even when he's not physically around to see it. Rizzo serves as his sidekick. Kermit, like Mickey, plays Bob Cratchit. Miss Piggy plays his wife. Fozzie plays Fezziwig, or Fozziewig as he's called here. Robin plays Tiny Tim, and Statler and Waldorf, more commonly known as the old guys from the Muppets, play the Marley brothers, Jacob and Robert. Statler and Waldorf are hilarious in the role of the Marley brothers. Even after being condemned for all eternity, they still enjoy heckling people. Well, I guess they have to have fun some way. As for Scrooge, that role went to Michael Caine, who delivers one of his best performances. I'd put him up there with Alastair Sim as one of the best Scrooges of all time. Caine's Scrooge is a little different than most. He is portrayed as someone who never really knew how to have fun, even as a young man. Part of this is due to his lonely childhood. We see him spend all of his time studying until he graduated. Sam the Eagle, who plays the headmaster, encourages Scrooge to become a man of business. He even tells him not to tip the driver. So Sam is to blame for Scrooge becoming a miser. Most of the time, when we see young Scrooge at Fezziwig's party, he's enjoying himself. Here, he is telling Fozziewig about the cost of the party, showing how even at a young age, he is concerned about money above everything else. Thanks, Sam. As usual, it's his love of money that drove a wedge between him and Belle. The difference here is that he kept putting off their wedding. His reason for the constant delay is because business is bad. Belle realizes Scrooge values business above everything else, and breaks off their engagement. Thanks, Sam. The best part is when Scrooge encounters the absent-minded ghost of Christmas Present. He is fascinated by the ghost's jolly and fun-loving nature. You start to see him loosen up. Of all the ghosts Scrooge encounters, I'd say the ghost of Christmas Present is the closest he has to a friend. He taught Scrooge that it's okay to have fun, which is why it was kind of depressing to see him disappear. No Muppet movie is complete without great songs. The Muppets Christmas Carol has some of the catchiest songs ever. My favorites being It Feels Like Christmas and Thankful Heart. One song that got left out in the original theatrical run was When Love Is Gone. The reason for this is that it caused a test audience that was made up of family with kids to grow restless. It was believed that the song slowed the movie down, so it was taken out. I think taking the song out was a mistake. Belle breaking off her engagement with Scrooge is a crucial moment. It's the moment that Scrooge became the man he is. Since this is a musical, shouldn't it get a song? Thankfully, When Love Is Gone was put back in the movie when it was released to home video, and has remained a part of the movie ever since. The Muppets Christmas Carol is a great adaptation for anyone who is a fan of musicals or the Muppets, or both. It proved that the Muppets could go on without the involvement of Jim Henson. So far, we've seen Mr. Magoo, Mickey Mouse, and the Muppets act out A Christmas Carol, while the Jetsons did their own loose adaptation, and the Ghostbusters interfered with the story. How will the Flintstones do their own version of A Christmas Carol? It turns out that they decided to follow Mr. Magoo's example, and have the characters perform it as a play. You would think that Fred would be cast in the role of Bob Cratchit, like Mickey, Kermit, and even George, but instead he is cast as Scrooge. Throughout the movie, Mr. Slate states that he should have been cast as Scrooge, but he's reminded that would have been typecasting. Instead, he is cast as Jacob Marley. Barney is both Cratchit and Fezziwig. Betty is Mrs. Cratchit, Pebbles is their daughter, Dino is their pet and the ghost of Christmas future, and Bam Bam is Tiny Tim. As for Wilma, well, a run-on gag is that the bedrock bug is going around, and a lot of people are catching it, including the actors. So Wilma has to play the ghost of Christmas past, Belle, and one of the charity collectors. She is also the stage manager and costume designer. Boy, Wilma is sure wearing a lot of hats. The Flintstones Christmas Carol has always been among my least favorite versions of A Christmas Carol. Don't get me wrong. The characters do a great job at adapting the story in the Flintstones universe. The Bedrock Bug run-on gag is pretty funny. And it's fun to see Philo Courts from the Flintstone Kids as an adult. Even though I always thought he would have been a scientist rather than a cop. The problem with it is the side plot. You see, Fred got a swelled head ever since he was cast in the lead. He gets so caught up in rehearsing and stardom that he starts to act like a jerk, always bragging about being the star. He even forgets about buying presents for Wilma and Pebbles. Though to his credit, he does feel bad about it and runs out to buy some just before the play. There was one other thing he forgot to do. Pick up Pebbles from the daycare center. Before he went to work, Fred had to drop off his daughter at the daycare center. Wilma has to arrive at the theater early, so she tells Fred he has to pick up Pebbles at 4 o'clock. The problem is he didn't hear it. Too busy rehearsing his lines. So when 4 o'clock came, Fred forgets to pick up Pebbles. Though that's kind of a stretch, seeing as he didn't even know he was supposed to pick her up. Wilma berates Fred when he shows up at the theater, and throughout the production, she is furious with him. Fred does come to realize that his behavior was wrong. He tries to apologize to Wilma, but she refuses to talk to him. Even though I understand why Wilma is upset with him, I think she was a little hard on Fred. He didn't even know he was supposed to pick up Pebbles. Admittedly, he should have been paying attention to her, but at the same time, he was in a hurry to get to work. Besides, he left Pebbles at a daycare center, a perfectly safe place. Plus, Barney was able to pick her up. Even if he couldn't, the lady at the daycare center happened to have a part in the play, so she could have just brought Pebbles along. Another thing that always bugged me is that throughout the movie, the characters refer to Fred as Scrooge, and he takes it as a compliment. I get why he takes it as a compliment, since he is playing the character, but I can't understand why everyone else keeps calling him Scrooge. Do they understand anything about the character? Because I don't think they do. Scrooge had a lonely childhood because his father wanted little to do with him. He was close to his sister Fan, but she died young. He worked for a great man and was at one time engaged to be married. Sadly, Scrooge became blinded by his love of money when he went into business for himself, causing Belle to break off their engagement. As a result, Scrooge became hard-hearted. He didn't care about helping the poor, saying that the surplus population would decrease if the poor who didn't want to go to the workhouse would die. He was a miser, not even spending his money on himself. It was because of his negative experience with Christmas that Scrooge developed a hatred for the holiday. Scrooge needed to be visited by his dead partner and three ghosts before he could reform. Fred Flintstone, on the other hand, landed the starring role in the play and got a fat head. He did take the time to buy presents for his wife and daughter, and tried to apologize for his actions. These are things Scrooge never would have done on his own. Fred was simply a jerk. Scrooge had a stone-cold heart. The two are hardly the same. There are better versions of A Christmas Carol, and there are way better Flintstones Christmas specials. There's an adaptation of A Christmas Carol from 1997, where Tim Curry does the voice of Scrooge? How did I miss that? Tim Curry is one of my favorite actors. He was great in Home Alone 2 and Muppet Treasure Island. So, he's bound to be great in 1997's A Christmas Carol, right? Right. Some of you might have expected me to say wrong. But this is Tim Curry we're talking about. Even if the movie sucks, he's always great. Not that 1997's A Christmas Carol sucks. It's surprisingly a good adaptation. Like any adaptation, it does its own thing with the story. We see Tiny Tim visit Bob Cratchit at the Counting House. Scrooge remarks that he never knew Cratchit had a family. Although I prefer Scrooge seeing Tiny Tim for the first time with the Ghost of Christmas Present, this is an interesting addition. It shows how Scrooge takes no interest in Cratchit, even though he's worked for him for years. It's also nice to see Scrooge's love of literature, his favorite being Robinson Crusoe. Whenever adaptations include Fan, she brings him home with the blessing of their father, like she did in the book. Here, she's like, "You're my brother, Ebenezer. You're coming home for Christmas whether father likes it or not." Maybe it's a cliche to say this, but you go, girl. Fan is also mentioned by Fred, as he sings Santa's Sooty Suit during his party. It's a song Fan and Scrooge used to sing together. Santa's Sooty Suit is catchy and easily the best song in the movie. It's nice that Fred is keeping the memory of his mother alive. Fan is also mentioned by Scrooge at the end, where he asks Fred for forgiveness. Adaptations either show the Ghost of Christmas Past as a girl or a boy. The reason for this is that Dickens never specified its gender. Here, he's depicted as a young boy. The Ghost of Christmas Present, as far as I know, has always been shown as a man, since that's how Dickens described him. Here, the ghost is a woman, voiced by Whoopi Goldberg. Ordinarily, I'm not a fan of gender swap, but there are plenty of adaptations that show him as a man, so why not have one where the Ghost of Christmas Present is a woman? When Scrooge is with the Ghost of Christmas Future, we normally see the laundress, the charwoman, and the undertaker visit Old Joe to fence the stuff they stole from Scrooge after his death. Here, we see two of them steal his stuff, as Scrooge's dead body lays there. Different adaptations choose different endings to the story. Some follow the book's ending, where Scrooge visits Fred on Christmas and reveals to Cratchit how much he's changed the next day. Others have it that Scrooge visits the Cratchits on Christmas. Mickey's Christmas Carol showed Scrooge telling Fred he'd be over later, and the Muppets' Christmas Carol showed Scrooge visit Fred first, then go to the Cratchits with Fred and others. Here, Fred and his wife show up to the Cratchits first, then Scrooge comes over. I don't believe I've ever seen an adaptation do that before. The most out-of-place addition to this version is Scrooge's bulldog Debit. Scrooge is a miser. It's hard to believe that he would spend money on a dog. Plus, the character is supposed to be lonely. Owning a dog means Scrooge isn't lonely. Debit may not be a human companion, but he's still a companion. I admit, I found the dog's antics funny, and I do give the movie credit for not over-relying on him. Plus, it's kind of funny that Scrooge named his dog Debit. I wouldn't say 1997's A Christmas Carol is the best version of the story. It's still fun to watch. If only for Tim Curry. I was surprised when I first heard that Disney was making a new version of A Christmas Carol, since they technically already adapted it twice. The first time obviously being Mickey's Christmas Carol, and the second time being the Muppets' Christmas Carol. Although Disney didn't own the Muppets at the time, they still had a hand in the movie. The difference here is that they chose not to use popular cartoon characters or puppets to adapt the story. They also got Robert Zemeckis to direct the movie. He used motion capture like he did with The Polar Express. Jim Carrey was cast in the role of Scrooge, as well as the Ghost of Christmas. To be honest, I thought this movie was going to suck. Now that I've seen it, I think it's okay. What's good about it? I like that they showed the book at the beginning with the words "Marley is dead." It was also nice that they showed Scrooge reluctantly pay the undertaker for Marley's funeral, only to take the coins from Marley's eyes. Scrooge McDuck still holds the prize for cheapest Scrooge. The motion capture looks great. It makes the movie look like the original illustrations by John Leech. Similar to Richard Williams' A Christmas Carol, the way they had ignorance and want age up when they said, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" was pretty effective. Even though I wish they followed Richard Williams' example and made the Ghost of Christmas Past look as Dickens described it, I do like the candle look. I also like how they included the Phantom Hearse from the book, even though it was supposed to come before Marley rather than with the Ghost of Christmas Future. Although I was skeptical of Jim Carrey as Scrooge, he does do a good job. There were times where I actually forgot it was him. Now for what's wrong with it. Disney's A Christmas Carol suffers the same problem the Polar Express has. Sometimes the movie is more interested in showing off motion capture than it is in the story. Granted, it's not as big a problem here as it was with the Polar Express. Still, it would be nice if Robert Zemeckis learned to use motion capture to enhance the story rather than detract from it. My least favorite part is when they shrunk down Scrooge when he's in the future. It doesn't add anything except to show off motion capture. They had Scrooge fall into his grave as they did in Mickey's Christmas Carol, though I think it's more effective in Mickey's Christmas Carol than it is here. Disney's A Christmas Carol was a missed opportunity to do a movie that was closer to the book. Its longer runtime could have allowed the story to flow better than in Richard Williams' A Christmas Carol. As it is, this adaptation isn't bad. It's just that Mickey's Christmas Carol and the Muppets' Christmas Carol were superior. Still, if you're a fan of Robert Zemeckis' motion capture movies, check it out. Christmas is coming to Smurf Village, and all the Smurfs are getting ready to celebrate. Except for Grouchy, who hasn't even decorated his house. The Smurfs go to his house to see if there's anything wrong. It turns out Grouchy hates Christmas, so naturally he wants no part in the celebration. Even though he loved the holiday in the past, plus, it's his job to put the star on top of the tree. Papa Smurf conjures up the Christmas spirit in order to help Grouchy. The special doesn't have a Marley. It's a little strange they don't have one, since Marley is the one who serves as an example of what would happen to Scrooge if he doesn't change his ways. Then again, I don't know who would play Marley, and the special works without him. Anyway, the Christmas spirit causes the animation to go from CG to 2D. Grouchy is visited by the ghost of Christmas past, played by Smurfette. We learned that in the past, Christmas was the one time of year where Grouchy was cheerful. He loved Christmas just as much as the other Smurfs. Maybe even more. So what happened? The one thing Grouchy wanted for Christmas was a hang glider. Instead, he got a new hat. Year after year after year after year after year. Finally, when it looked like he was going to get a hang glider, it turns out Jokey was playing a prank on him, and he got another hat. Fed up, Grouchy yells, "I hate hats!" and storms off. On the one hand, I don't blame him for his reaction. Grouchy wants a hang glider, and he keeps getting a hat. Also, it was a cruel prank to play on him on Christmas. On the other hand, I imagine a Smurf getting a hat for Christmas would be like a human getting socks or underwear for Christmas. It may not be an extravagant gift, but it's still something we all need. Plus, he threw down the hat in front of Papa Smurf, who... Wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. The Ghost of Christmas Present is played by Brainy. He shows Grouchy each Smurf plays a role in the preparation for Christmas. Since he refused to put the star on the tree, Clumsy decided to do it. Let's just say there's a reason why he's called Clumsy. Grouchy learns that Papa Smurf personally makes all of the hats for the Smurfs each year. Every one is made to suit the needs of the Smurf it's given to, making this scene even more heartbreaking. Finally, the Ghost of Christmas Future is played by Hefty. He shows Grouchy that if the shadows remain unchanged, Gargamel will capture all of the Smurfs. It's amazing how much effort was put into making the Smurfs Christmas Carol, considering that it was meant to be a bonus feature on the DVD of the first live-action movie. It's a great loose adaptation of A Christmas Carol, and it has great animation, both CG and 2D. As good as the Smurfs look in CG, I'm glad they used 2D animation for Grouchy's visit from the Ghost of Christmas. I'm also glad they show it on TV around this time of year. For anyone who's wondering, the hat Papa Smurf makes for Grouchy each year also serves as a hang glider. That's even cooler than a hang glider, because you can wear it everywhere.